Hello and welcome to part 10 of our video series on building a Node, Express and Postgres based API. Today we're going to be working through our user creation endpoint, but most specifically the storage part of it where we actually interact with the Postgres database to store the created user. Now the way that I like to think about routes within an API, I tend to split them into three separate areas. One being the root endpoint, and this is going to handle things like validation. The second part is the handlers, which are going to handle the business logic for us. So if you were to want to email a user after you've created the user and saved them into the database, then you typically bundle that within your business logic. And then finally, the storage layer. So we tend to abstract the storage layer away so that we can have functions that can be reused across our application, whether that's inserting a user into the database, updating a user, or fetching a user. So we tend to abstract that away. And what we're going to be doing is we'll work in reverse order because it tends to make things a little bit easier for testing. So we'll start with the storage layer first. So let's jump in. What we're going to do is we'll head into our domain section here, and we're going to add in a new folder called user, which is going to have all of our code that is related to users within our API. And within here, we're going to add a file called store.js, and this is just going to be everything that's to deal with interaction with the storage mechanism, which is Postgres, for our users. So what we'll do first of all is we'll require Postgres, require DB, and then what we'll do is we'll create a class called user store. And this allows us just to namespace some of the functions that we have, because they'll be similarly named to other areas of the code base, like get user, save user, those types of things. So we'll namespace them by wrapping them up within a class. And what we'll do is we'll just add a static async function called insert user. And this is just going to take a single property, which is going to be user creation params. Now, this user creation params is essentially going to be what the people who are interacting with our API will send through to us to create a user on their behalf. So it's going to contain things like first name, last name, email address, password, those types of things. But obviously, because it's something that's coming from users, we can never be 100% sure of what we're going to receive. So what we'll do is we'll take all the steps that we can to make sure that we're only processing data that we care about from this particular set of parameters. And the way that we're going to do that at this stage is by destructuring this object and just picking out the properties that we want from it. So we're going to do that with first name, last name, email, and password for a user. And then we'll just do user equals user creation params, and this will just pull out all of these fields from this object and store them as variables for us to be able to access. And then what we need to do is we'll now start to interact with the database. So we'll put together a query. So we'll call this const user query equals await postgres.client.query. And now query takes two parameters. It takes the first, which is a string representing the query, and a second, which is an array of parameters that you want to pass in that will replace some placeholders within the query string. So what we'll do is we'll do insert into users first name, last name, email, password, email password, values, and this is where the syntax gets quite interesting. And then we'll pass in $1, $2, $3, $4. And this $1 would be this first name, $2 being last name, $3 being email, and $4 being password. And then what we do with the second parameter here is we pass in these dollar values that will get switched out for these values within this string. So we'll do first name, last, email, and password. Now, what you might be thinking to yourself is, why don't we just put these values within here using like interpolation? So if we were to switch this out for the backticks, then you could theoretically say this one should just be first name and then last name, email address, and so forth. Now, the issue with that is that opens you up for SQL injection attacks, because nothing within this interpolation actually sanitizes the values that gets passed in. So if a user was particularly nefarious, then they could send in a first name value that would actually break a database query like this and lead to either certain parts of your database being deleted, or even returning data that shouldn't be expected. And what the Postgres library does for you that's really nice is any values that get passed into your query as part of the second parameter here will actually get sanitized for you so that it protects you against SQL injection attacks. So general rule of thumb, there's no good reason to use interpolation within your queries. It's always best to leave it to the Postgres client to be able to do that for you and make sure that you're fully safe. So we've got this query that's running here, so it's inserting into the users table. We've got our first name and last name wrapped in speech marks here, because by default Postgres will lowercase all of the column names, and when we created these columns we created them in camel case, so we need to make sure they're wrapped in quote marks or speech marks to make sure that they don't get lowercased. And what this is going to be doing is, once this user is inserted, what we actually want to do, we'll just add a little bit more syntax here, returning star. And this little bit of syntax here will just make sure that whatever action is taken, we return the result of that action. So in this case, we're going to insert into the users table first name, last name, email address, and password with these values, and we're going to return the users that get inserted. Users being plural, but in this case, obviously, it's just a single user that gets inserted. And what we can do then is we can actually access the user that is inserted as part of that query result. So what we can do is we can return user query dot rows 0, and that will return the first of the created users, which in this case we're only creating one user, so we only actually need to return the first item. So this should give us our query for being able to insert a user by just passing in an object containing a first name, last name, email address, and password, and it will return us the database representation of that user, which will contain a couple of extra fields like an ID and a created at timestamp as well, which we defined when we created the table. So all that's left for us to do is do module.exports equals, and then we'll just export the user store like so. And now that we've got this exported, we can go ahead and we can start adding our unit tests for this particular piece of the code. So what we'll do first of all is we'll import or require the user store equals require store, and then what we'll do is we will, because what we are going to need to do is make use of the database, we're going to need to mock that out. So we'll do that, and then we'll add in, I'll just grab this before each hook that we're going to be using to reset all the mocks before any of our tests are run. And then we'll do describe, and then we'll have user store, describe, insert user, and then now we'll start to write our tests. So we're going to have test calls query with the correct parameters in the expected order. So what we're going to be doing when we're testing this particular function is we want to make sure that first of all this query gets called with the right first parameter here, so this string. We're also going to want to check that the second parameter that we pass in here is a set of fields, but in the right order. Because if for some reason somebody came in at a later date and changed and said, "Oh, actually, I want first name to be the second parameter after last name," but they don't actually go in and change these two here, you'll start to have erroneous data within your database. So what we'll do is we'll just make sure that everything is inserted in the right order and expected. So it'll give us an element of regression security as well. So what we'll do is we'll just do this. This needs to be an async function because this is something we'll need to await on. And then what we'll do is we will create a user that we're going to pass in first of all. And this will be our mock data essentially. So we're going to do first name, John, last name, Smith, email, john.smith@test.com, and then password 123 exclamation mark. So that's going to be the user that we're going to be passing in here. What we're going to need to do now is when we start to look at what we need to do with our test, when this Postgres client query gets called, what we're expecting is the user to be returned from that. So we actually need to create a resolved value for this particular mock. And the way that we do that is we'll create a new variable called dbSendMock, and we'll just make this require db.postgres.client.query.mock resolved value. And what we'll put in this mock resolved value is what we're expecting to get returned from it. So we know that it's going to be a rows item within an object, and it's going to be an array of users. So what we can do is we'll just mock out the object here, and then we'll have rows, and we know that's going to be an array of users. So what we can do is we can just say, when this gets called, I want you to mock this return value or this resolved value and resolve a user at the end of it. And then what we need to do is we'll create a response variable which we can inspect later and wait user store dot insert user. So this gives us the mock that we need to use, and we'll actually make use of this dbSendMock to make sure that the arguments that are passed into this query here actually match what we're expecting as well, and we'll use this res here to assert against that. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is we'll want to assert the response. So expect res dot to equal user, and what we'll do is we're going along, we'll just do, as we're writing our assertions, we'll just test them as we're going, just to make sure that we catch any errors immediately. So that's what we can do there. One thing I have noticed, we've got a slight bug here where our database connection isn't closing properly, and I'm fairly sure that it's within the startup file here. We've got our database that's required, but we don't actually mock it in here. So I'm just going to tidy this up and just add a mock in here, and what we should find is when we run these unit tests, yeah, that will exit. Okay, so you can just add that small tweak in there just to make sure that those close off properly. So back to these tests, what we're going to want to do now is we're going to want to make sure that client.query is called. So we'll do an expect query to have been called times 1. So we're expecting that to have been called at least once, which it does, and that part of the test passes. Now what we're going to do is we're going to test the function inputs for this query here. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to try and access the calls to that particular function like so. So we'll do const function inputs equals db send mock dot calls. So this will give us the calls to this particular function, and we want to access the first call because that's the only time that it's going to be called for this particular one here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say for the first parameter that is passed into query, we're going to want to check that it is equal to this string that we're expecting here. So we'll just grab this string and we'll drop this into here. So what we'll do is we'll do expect function inputs 0. So 0 being the first argument or first parameter that's passed to this call. Dot to equal, and then we'll pass in the string that we're expecting. And we'll run the unit test. And we'll just make sure that that's passing. Now you might be wondering to yourself, what value does this add? And right now it doesn't necessarily add a huge amount of value because we just copy and pasted this string. But what you will find is that it will protect you in the future, because if somebody comes along and switches these two around like we were talking about earlier, but doesn't change the other bits around, then what you'll find is that your test will then fail, and it will say that it was expecting them to be in that order. So what this does is it'll protect you against any mistakes being made in the future. So it's not necessarily a test that's going to help you right now, but it'll certainly protect you in the future. And now what's left for us to do is write an assertion just for these set of arguments, because we want to make sure that these arguments are passed in the order that we're expecting. So what we'll do is we'll just copy this line here, we'll just get rid of this bit of text, and instead of the first argument we actually want to access a second argument, and what we want to do is that second argument is then an array. So we want to access the first item within the array, and we'll just make sure that equals user.firstname, and then we've got 4 properties. So the second one, the second one should be user.lastname. The third one should be user.email, and then the fourth one should be user.password. And now we'll just rerun our tests again. And what we should do is we should have all of our tests passing. We should retain our 100% test coverage. And now what we've got is a test that will protect us against a whole bunch of different scenarios. So, if somebody changes the order of these without changing the order that's expected within the string, then we'll get an error. And people will actually need to go in and fix these unit tests to be able to say, yeah, that's what we're expecting now. So it just stops those kind of small errors happening first. So we've got tests that cover all of it. So the number of times that the function is called, the response from the function, and all of the parameters that are actually called when we're inserting a user. So that'll give us a good amount of security within our tests. So that's all we're going to need to do for this particular part of the video series. Next, we'll have a look at wiring up a handler to deal with all of the business logic for when we're creating user, and we'll wrap up some unit tests for that in the next video. So for now, that's it, and I'll see you on the next video.